We just got back from something we've never done before. From January 3rd through February 8th, we stacked 5 cruises back to back with flights, hotels, repositioning, with transitions in between every single one. And this wasn't spread out over a year, this was one continuous stretch. When you zoom out, this wasn't one vacation, it was a system test. 36 days of movement, different ports, different ships, different cities. And every time we changed locations, there was a cost attached to it. Now, here's what made this interesting. We tracked every single dollar. No estimates, not averages, not around this much. Real numbers. Every Uber, every transfer, every cruise payment, every airport ride. Because we had a goal. We wanted to see if we could structure 5 cruises for around $2,500 total. Not per cruise, total. And on paper, it looked completely doable. Cruises were cheap, hotels were covered with points, flights were covered with points. When we mapped it out initially, it felt like we had cracked it. When you look at these numbers at first glance, it feels efficient. It feels controlled. It feels like cruising might actually be one of the most affordable ways to travel long term. But once we zoomed out, that's not where the problem was. And this is where it gets interesting. Because the biggest expense wasn't the cruises, it wasn't the flights, and it wasn't even the hotels. It was everything in between. And that's not what everybody talks about. When people look at travel budgets, they think flights, hotels, cruises. They don't think about getting from the airport to the hotel, from the hotel to the port, from the port back to the airport. Doing that 5 separate times, that's where things started to shift. And this is important because if you just look at cruise pricing alone, you'd think this worked perfectly. But this wasn't just about price, it was about structure. This looked efficient, but it wasn't optimized. And there's a big difference between those two. So today I'm breaking down what the cruises actually cost, what the flights and hotels really cost, where the money quietly stacked, and what we're changing next. Because we're not guessing anymore, we're testing. And the results weren't what we expected. Let's start with the part everyone focuses on, the cruises. Because when people hear 5 cruises in 1 month, they immediately assume this is where the budget explodes. So here's what we actually paid. On Sun Princess, it was $740 for a 7-night cruise, minus a $400 onboard credit, which in essence nets a $340 for the both of us for 7 nights. Radiance was a 4-night cruise, and it was $290, and 30 of that was an upgrade because a cheap balcony cabin came up, so we upgraded. Carnival Horizon was $500 minus a $200 onboard credit, nets about $300. Liberty of the Seas was a 4-night cruise. Oh, Horizon was 8 nights. Liberty of the Seas was a 4-night cruise for $248, and Jewel of the Seas was a 7-night for $538. Look at those numbers for a second. It doesn't look insane. It doesn't look like 5 separate vacations. And that's what surprised us the first time we added it up. Because when you hear 5 cruises, your brain assumes luxury level spending. But these weren't $5,000 sailings. 2 of these were 4-night itineraries. Most of them were inside or standard cabins. We only upgraded the one to a balcony. Nothing extreme. And now, yes, these were casino comp cruises. And I want to explain that briefly because people disconnect here. They either think that doesn't apply to me or that's not real pricing. But here's the reality. Every experienced traveler has a system. Some use airline miles, some use credit card bonuses, some use loyalty status, some use last minute deals. We use all of those. This is definitely one of ours. It's not magic, it's a strategy, and it took time to build it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If you just stop here, this looks like a massive win. But let's zoom out for contrast. If we had paid standard pricing, these cruises would have easily doubled or even tripled the out-of-pocket total. So when people say cruises aren't cheap, they're not wrong. But pricing depends on structure. Now, here's another layer. When you break it down per day, some of these were coming in at $70 to $100 a day per room for food, entertainment. And that's where cruising becomes interesting because land travel doesn't bundle like that. On land, you pay the hotel separate, the food is separate, the entertainment is separate, and psychologically, bundled pricing feels safer. It feels controlled, it feels predictable, which is exactly why this looked like it was going to work. And this is important. At this point in the spreadsheet, we were confident. We were thinking, okay, 5 cruises for this price? This is actually pretty efficient. But efficiency and optimization are not the same thing, and that's the shift. If you only looked at cruise pricing, the experiment worked. If this were 5 separate vacations spread out over a year, we would have called this a huge win. But this wasn't 5 vacations. This was one continuous structure, and structure changes the math. Because once you step off the ship, bundling disappears. And that's where things start to shift. If you stop at cruise costs, this model looks incredibly efficient. Room covered, food covered, entertainment covered. You're not swiping your card continuously. You're not paying for random meals, and you're not deciding where to go every night. Your daily spending drops dramatically. And psychologically, that feels stable. It feels controlled, and it feels like you've removed chaos from travel. And that is powerful. Look at this for a second. Cruise per day, around $85. Land per day, hotel, $180, food, $60, entertainment, $40. You're already at $280, and that's before transportation. So when you compare them side by side, cruising looks like a no-brainer. And this is where we felt confident, because on the cruise, you wake up, you eat, you relax, you see a show, you go to bed. No incremental charges are hitting your phone. No constant add to cart. That bundled environment lowers financial stress. And when financial stress drops, spending feels safe. But here's the mistake. The mistake is stopping the analysis here. Because cruises are structured environments. They're controlled ecosystems. You board the ship, and for a few days, you exist inside of a closed system. You're not commuting, you're not Ubering, you're not changing cities. And that containment creates the illusion of efficiency. But the moment you leave that structure, you re-enter friction, and friction costs money. This is the real shift. On the ship, everything is bundled. Off the ship, everything is separated again. Transportation, meals, coffee, luggage handling, time buffers, hotel nights. And what we underestimated was how much the transitions would stack. Because here's what happens psychologically. When you're on a cruise, you're not thinking about transportation costs. When you're in a hotel between cruises, you're not thinking about cumulative spending. Every segment feels very isolated, but financially, they're not isolated. They're cumulative, and that's the trap. Let me explain it this way. If we had taken one cruise, flew home, and done nothing else, the whole model works beautifully. If we had taken 2 cruises, spaced out months apart, still efficient. But when you stack 5 close together, you multiply those friction points, and friction multiplies spending. Not because the cruise changed, because the structure changed. And this is the part we didn't fully appreciate until we saw the spreadsheet. There's also something subtle that happens when you're in transition mode. You're tired, you just disembarked, you have luggage, you're navigating a new city, and when you're tired, convenience wins. When you don't price shop the Uber, you don't walk the extra mile, you don't optimize the route, you pay for simplicity. And simplicity costs money. So on paper, cruising looks like the solution, but cruising wasn't the full system. It was only part of the system. And the system includes what happens before and after every sailing. And that's where the numbers started to shift. Let's talk about flights and hotels first. Cruises are only part of the equation because every time you get off a ship, you still have to live somewhere. You need a bed, you need transportation, you need to reposition to the next port. And this is where most travel budgets quietly expand. For us, the hotels were covered. We paid for hotels with points, all paid with points. Now, on the surface, that sounds like free. But here's what most people miss: covered does not mean free. It means prepaid through strategy. It means we moved spending to an earlier timeline. It means we built optionality over years. And that's an important distinction because this didn't happen overnight. We didn't wake up one day with free flights and free hotels. This was years of sign up bonuses, category spending, understanding transfer partners, timing redemptions properly, and not burning points on bad value. And honestly, we made mistakes early on. We redeemed poorly. We chased status that didn't matter. We wasted points on low return bookings. Over time, we got more intentional. But that's why this trip could be structured this way. But here's the part that really puts this in perspective. If we had paid cash for this portion alone, flights and hotels would have added roughly $3,000 to the total. And suddenly, this entire experiment looks completely different. So when someone sees 5 cruises and thinks there's no way that's affordable, they might be right without strategy. Points dramatically changed the math, but they didn't remove the structure. And this is where things start to get interesting. Because even though flights and hotels were covered, they still created transitions, and transitions carry weight, not just financially, logistically, emotionally, and energy-wise. On paper, points made this look brilliant. Flights discounted, cruises discounted, hotels were covered. But what we underestimated was how many times we had to reposition between those free stays. Because here's what happens in real life. A cruise ends at 8 a.m. Hotel check-in is usually not till 4. Flight isn't until the next day. Now you need transportation, luggage storage, food between meals, time buffers, and every one of those moments creates an opportunity for spending. Not massive spending, but incremental spending. And incremental spending stacks. There's also something subtle here. When something feels free, you become less sensitive to the surrounding costs. If we had paid $1,800 cash for hotels, we would have optimized every transfer, every meal, every Uber. But because the hotel itself feels covered, the surrounding friction doesn't feel urgent. And that's a psychological shift. Points removed one major expense, but they didn't remove the transitions. And the transitions are what started to bend the curve. So yes, flights and hotels were covered. And yes, that changed the math dramatically. But they also multiplied movement. And movement is where this starts to get expensive. Let's talk about transportation, because this is where the spreadsheet really surprised us. The biggest expense wasn't the cruises. It wasn't the flights, and it wasn't the hotels. It was the movement. Ubers, transfers, trains, shuttles. Total, we spent $255 in just transportation. $255 doesn't sound dramatic. It doesn't sound like a breaking point. It doesn't feel like a mistake. But here's why it matters. Look at these numbers. None of them really feel big. Not one of them feels reckless. Every single one feels reasonable. If you just got off a ship, you have luggage, you're in a new city, you're tired, you're not price shopping a $12 Uber. You're not walking 2 miles to save $18. You hit confirm and you move. You don't think about it. That's how micro spending works. It hides inside of convenience. But here's the multiplier. 5 cruises equals 5 cycles of movement. Airport, hotel, port. Port, airport, hotel. Hotel, next port, repeat. Each cycle doesn't feel expensive, but the structure multiplies it. And this is the moment we saw it clearly. The cruises were controlled environments. Transportation was not. And boy, do those Ubers skyrocket when you get in from a cruise. Cruises bundle your cost, movement fragments cost, and fragmentation is where your budget leaks. When you see it visually, you realize this wasn't 5 vacations. It was 5 reset points, 5 repositionings, 5 luggage transfers, 5 Uber stacks. And here's the part we didn't anticipate. Every transition carries decision fatigue. And when decision fatigue increases, optimization decreases. You choose convenience over efficiency every time. There's also something subtle happening psychologically. When you're mid-trip, you stop thinking about the whole total. You start thinking transactionally. This is just $15, this is just $22, this is just $30. But your spreadsheet doesn't think that way. It adds everything. And when we zoomed out, we realized something very important. The leak wasn't dramatic, it was quiet. Not in one explosion, but in small taps that were left running. Now, here's where this becomes strategic. If we had structured this differently, if we had stayed on the same ship or done a true back-to-back where we didn't have a hotel between or no airport repositioning, most of that will disappear. Not because cruising got cheaper, but because the structure got tighter. That's the lesson. The cruises were not expensive. The movement was. And once we saw that, the pattern became obvious. Too many transitions, too much repositioning, too much movement. And that's where the model starts to bend. Let's zoom out and look at the pattern. Here's what this test actually showed us. The issue wasn't the big expenses, it was the pattern. When we stepped back and stopped looking at individual numbers and instead looked at structure, the problem became obvious. Nothing was outrageous, nothing was reckless, nothing felt irresponsible, but the rhythm of the trip was chaotic, and chaos costs money. We structured this like 5 separate trips instead of one continuous system. And that's the break point, because separate trips make sense. Fly somewhere, cruise, come home, reset. But this wasn't that. This was cruise, reposition, cruise, reposition, cruise, reposition. You get the idea. 5 times. And every reset adds friction. When you see it on a calendar, it feels very different. It stops feeling like a vacation and starts feeling like you're in constant motion. There's no stability, no anchor point, no stretch of time where you're just existing somewhere. It's always pack, move, unload, repack, move again. And here's what that does. Movement increases transportation costs, buffer costs, impulse spending, and energy drain. And energy drain affects decision making, which affects spending, and that's the hidden layer. There's also something emotional here. Every time you change locations, you reset mentally. New check-in, new directions, new logistics, new layout, new timing. And that reset has a cost, not just in dollars, in bandwidth. And when bandwidth decreases, you default to convenience. And convenience costs money. That's the break point. Not a number, a pattern. This isn't about cruise pricing. Cruise pricing was actually strong. It's about structural efficiency. You can have cheap components and still build an expensive system. That's the lesson. If you tighten structure, you reduce friction. If you reduce friction, you reduce leakage. And leakage is what bent this trip. If we had done one 14-day cruise on the same ship with no hotel in between or no repositioning flights, the entire pattern changes. Same ocean, same product, different structure, very different cost curve. And once we realized that, the next question became obvious. If movement is the leak, what happens if we eliminate movement? And that's what we're testing next. This is the honest breakdown, not dramatic, not clickbait, just trade-offs. Because this wasn't a disaster. A lot of it worked really well. Cruises worked, predictable daily cost worked, Bundled food worked. Impulse spending dropped significantly while on board. When we were on the ship, we were stable. That part was actually impressive. If the goal was controlled by daily costs, cruising delivered. But here's the tension. The parts that worked only worked inside the container. The moment we left the container, the efficiency disappeared. And that's the nuance. Tight stacking, port changes, flight repositioning, these weren't bad decisions, they were structural decisions. And structural decisions have compounding effects. Efficient felt good, optimized reduces friction. And those are not the same thing. Efficient means each piece looks affordable. Optimized means the whole system flows smoothly. We built affordable pieces, but we didn't build a frictionless system. That's the difference. Here's a simple way to say it. We optimized price. We didn't optimize geography. We optimized points. We didn't optimize movement. And movement is what multiplied the cost. There's also something important here. This trip didn't fail. It revealed the ceiling of this structure. We now know 5 cruises close together can work, but only if movement is minimized. And that's a very different takeaway than cruising is expensive. Cruising wasn't expensive. Fragmentation is what was expensive. So what changes? Not the cruise line, not the loyalty strategy, not the point system, the structure. Longer back-to-backs, same port, no flight between sailings, fewer resets, because if resets creates the friction, then stability creates efficiency. This experiment didn't answer is cruising cheap. It answered what breaks the model. And now we know it's not price, it's movement. So the next test removes movement. And that's where this gets interesting. So instead of just saying what we would change, we're actually testing it. Because theories are easy, spreadsheets are easy, real world structure is different. And the only way to know if this model tightens is to remove the variable we just identified, movement. On our next set of cruises, which we leave tomorrow, are true back-to-back. Same ship, no airport repositioning, no hotel resets, no Uber stack, no transfer days, 14 days, one place. And that changes the structure entirely. Now here's why this matters. If movement is what created the leak, then eliminating movement should tighten the curve. Not because cruising has changed, not because pricing changed, because structure changed. And structure is what we're really testing now. If this works the way we think it will, we eliminate most transportation stacking, hotel buffer nights, mid-trip flights, which could conservatively remove $1,000 of structural friction. And that's without changing cruise pricing at all. We're not changing the strategy, we're changing how it's built. That's the shift. Because the strategy worked, the architecture didn't. And architecture determines the outcome. Now, that doesn't automatically mean it will work. Longer sailings could introduce new variables. Higher onboard spending, cabin fatigue, different pricing tiers. There's always trade-offs. But what this should tell us is whether reducing transitions actually moves the number the way we expect it to. If the cost drops significantly, we've identified the real lever. If it doesn't, then something else is driving it. And that's valuable either way. So I'm genuinely curious. Do you think staying on the same ship longer will actually lower the overall cost? Or will it just shift the spending somewhere else? Because that's the test. And we are about to find out. Next time we'll show the actual numbers, same strategy, different structure. And we'll see what changes. Now I need to pause for a second because this entire experiment only worked for one reason. Flights and hotels were not paid in cash. They were paid in points. And that didn't happen accidentally. That happened because we built a system. And if you're serious about doing travel like this, not once but repeatedly, you need a way to consistently find high value redemptions. That's where Daily Drop comes in. Daily Drop shows high value flight deals, transfer partner sweet spots, Point opportunities, mistake fares. Instead of you digging through search engines for hours, and when you're stacking repositioning flights like we were, that matters, because one bad redemption can destroy the math. The difference between someone who collects points and someone who strategically uses points is knowing where the leverage is. Daily Drop simplifies that process. I've got my affiliate link down in the description below. If you use it, it supports the channel and it helps you start building the same kind of flexibility we're using here. Because here's the part we haven't even broken down yet. We haven't talked about which cards build these balances, which bonuses mattered, which ones weren't worth it, how long it actually took us, and what we would do differently if we were starting today. Because here's the truth. The cruise experiment is only half the story. The real engine behind this entire model is the credit card strategy. And in the next video, I'm breaking down exactly which cards funded this, how we structured it, how long it took us to accumulate, and whether this is actually sustainable long term. Because if you don't build the engine correctly, none of this works. Now, even with the points doing the heavy lifting, structure still determines the outcome. And that's what this experiment just revealed. This experiment wasn't about whether cruising is cheap. It was about whether the structure works. And what we learned is simple. If cruise pricing wasn't the problem, the movement was. 5 affordable components can still create an expensive system because structure determines outcome, not price alone. Now, the next test removes movement completely. Same strategy, different architecture. And that will tell us whether the leak was really friction or something deeper. And then after that, we're breaking down the credit card engine that made this even possible in the first place. Because without that engine, none of this works. If you want to see whether back-to-back actually drops the number, make sure you're subscribed, because we're not theorizing, we're building this in real time. And we'll see you in the next one. Bye now.